human geographers, we are back at it again. Tonight, we're going to be looking at our next theme of geography, and that is movement. Within the geographic context, movement means the mobility of people, goods, and ideas across the surface of the planet. But before we get into the who, what, and how things move, we need to look into how we can examine that movement. We've talked several times this year about the analysis of phenomenon in space, spatial analysis. Today, we start by looking at how we can analyze the distribution of something in space. Distribution is the arrangement of something across Earth's surface. And we could add to that definition that arrangement is made up of density, concentration, and pattern. Those are the three components of distribution. Density is the frequency with which something exists within a given unit of area. Frequency means how frequent something occurs. So it's a number. Density is number. So high density means that there's a lot of something. And low density means there's a low number of something within a certain area. Concentration is the spread of something over a given area. This is the relationship of items to one another. So high concentration means that they're very close together, what we call clustered. And low concentration means that they are further apart or dispersed. Finally, pattern kind of has a dual meaning. There is the geometric, linear, or irregular arrangement of something in a study area. This allows us to describe if something is arranged in a geometric shape, a line, or does not have a specific pattern. But also, there is a pattern of association. Are two phenomena related to one another and thus show a similar pattern? So let's practice. We've got 3 classroom setups with different number and arrangement of desks. Which classroom has the highest density of desks? A, B, or C? Which ones have lower density? What about concentration? Which would you say are more clustered? Which is more dispersed? And finally, we're talking about arrangement when we look at pattern. Find a geometric pattern in this classroom arrangement. How about a linear arrangement? Now, where is the irregular arrangement? Good practice analyzing the distribution of these classrooms. Class dismissed. Just kidding, we've got more. Here's another one. Let's start with the type of map that we're looking at here. It's a dot distribution, and it's going to help us understand the distribution of baseball teams. One of the more common misconceptions about density and concentration is that if density, or number, is high, then they must be more clustered or close together. So let's look at baseball teams. In 1952, there were 16 teams, but by 2012, there were 30 teams. So density did what? It became higher, it increased. But when talking about concentration, in 1952, all of the teams were in the eastern part of the United States. But by 2012, though, how would we describe that concentration? It's more dispersed with teams throughout the United States and Canada, meaning that the concentration decreased from high or clustered to low and dispersed as the density increased. So make sure that you describe number and spread, density and concentration as 2 different components of distribution. And then pattern, again, can have a couple different meanings. The easier description deals with how certain features are arranged in space. So let's look at an example from later in the school year. Certain cities around the world are arranged in different ways, depending on where in the world they're located. This is the Latin American city model, which describes a typical city in Latin America. There are certain geometric features of this model. Notice the central market area that combines with the central business district, or CBD. What geometric feature would that be? What geometric feature would we describe the periphery, where the slums of the city are located? And the elite residential corridor kind of looks triangular, doesn't it? And then we also have a linear commercial spine. So we have some examples of how geometric and linear patterns can exist on the landscape. But now let's talk about the ways that pattern can be used more often during this class. And that is as a way to identify the spatial association between different categories of information. In other words, is there a geographic relationship between two phenomena? Before we dive in, what type of maps are these? They are choropleth, but more specifically, categorical maps. We can start with these two examples, which look at climate in the top left and agricultural systems in the bottom right. It makes sense that not all types of agriculture can occur in every environment. Last lecture, we talked about how rice requires abundant water and fairly moderate temperatures. So the climate and agriculture system have a spatial association, a geographic relationship. There is a pattern there. Another one that we could use between these two maps is with dry climates. We don't tend to think of dry climates as conducive to agriculture, but there is a pattern here as well. Dry climates don't have enough water to grow crops, but they do have enough water for animals. So in dry climates, we tend to see more livestock as a form of agriculture. That's the pattern. And we'll get into the differences between how livestock are used in different areas of the world and all those details later in the year. So now that we understand how to examine spatial distribution, let's turn our focus onto the movement of phenomenon throughout space. And we start by discussing where they begin. This is known as the Hearth or Hearth, which is the region from which innovative ideas or cultural traits originate. And here's an example. These are where different civilizations originated. And notice that there are several Hearths, which means that different civilizations or cultures developed independently from one another. There wasn't just a single Hearth that spawned a culture that spread all over the world. And notice some of these Hearths of culture. What else originated in these same areas? These are the Hearths of agriculture as well. And in these same areas where agriculture and culture began, cities began to form too. Do you think that's all just a coincidence? No. There is a pattern and association between them. So what do you think is the association between agriculture, urbanization, and culture such that they all began in the same places? Jot down some notes on why you think they might be related. Let's bring those to class. And then, finally, before we move on from this slide, we've been talking about the ancient culture Hearths. Notice, though, there are modern culture Hearths as well. But we don't typically call it modern culture. So what's the term for widespread culture that originates in Hearths like the United States and Europe and Japan? It's culture that is spread throughout the world, coming from people and places we consider to be quite popular. Yeah, popular culture or pop culture comes from these modern Hearths. So now that we know that people, goods, and ideas originate in an area called the hearth, let's talk about how they move out from that hearth. We call that movement diffusion. Here's the definition: the process of spreading a feature or trend from one place to another over time. And there are different ways that a feature or trend will spread from place to place over time. So we have a flowchart with diffusion at the top. But that's just the spread of something. How does it spread? Within diffusion, we have two major schools. There is relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. Relocation diffusion is exactly as the name sounds. People move, they bring things with them. All right? Expansion diffusion means that it grows bigger, but it doesn't tell us how it gets bigger. So within expansion diffusion, there are three types. There is contagious, meaning it spreads through contact. Hierarchical, which means that there is a hierarchy. Think of a pyramid with an important person at the top. Finally, there is stimulus, which means that it changes a little bit as it diffuses. And I remember these three because contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus could be abbreviated CHS. Go Cougars. All right, let's start looking into these different types of diffusion with greater detail and provide some examples. We'll start with our standalone type of diffusion, which is relocation diffusion. This is the spread of a feature or trend through the bodily movement of people from one place to another. In other words, this method is about the movement of something over space. And when people move, they bring things with them. And that's relocation diffusion. We could look at coins in the Eurozone. They end up in a new spot. That's relocation diffusion. We also know where religions originated, so we're able to track their movement over time. But this example highlights something that is important with diffusion, and that is, while religion diffuses with the bodily movement of people through missionaries and conquest or colonialism, there's also the diffusion of religion through expansion diffusion. As people seek to gain additional followers, religions expanded. So it's important. There might be multiple forms of diffusion working on the same concept, but over time. And the same goes with our final example, the Columbian Exchange, which looks at the movement of crops, livestock, and disease from the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, to the New World, the Americas, and vice versa, that came about after Columbus, air quotes, discovers the New World, because you can't discover a place that already has people living there. But back to the crops and livestock. I love looking at different crops and where they came from and their role over time. For example, you can't have the Irish potato famine without the Columbian Exchange because Ireland didn't have potatoes until they diffused from South America. The United States couldn't have huge cattle ranches because cows aren't native to the Americas. And while they diffuse to new locations, remember there's a spatial association with climate and agriculture. So these crops and animals thrived in areas that had similar climates to their herds. But again, this is about movement. Once they're in the new spot, other forms of diffusion may begin to act on them. Take disease, for example. New diseases were brought to the New World, and that's relocation diffusion because it's in a new spot. But as soon as they begin infecting more people, we also have to talk about expansion diffusion, which is the spread of an innovation or idea through a population in an area in such a way that the number of those influenced grows continuously larger, resulting in an expanding area of dissemination. And while it's important to introduce the concept of expansion diffusion, this is one of the last times we're likely to use the term. And the reason behind that is that expansion diffusion is unlikely to be the best answer to any time we're talking about diffusion. For example, let's use the disease example from the last slide. When smallpox came to the New World, what type of diffusion would that be? Well, that's relocation diffusion. But when it starts to grow continuously larger, that's expansion diffusion. But it doesn't tell us how it grows continuously larger. So a better description of the growth of smallpox in the New World is that it spread through contact between people and things, a type of expansion diffusion called contagious diffusion. So expansion diffusion is correct in this case, but it isn't the best answer. And I know we hate when teachers say, right, but that isn't the best answer. But I have to be honest, it happens a lot in AP classes. So we have to be meticulous and critical as we go through this material. So we leave expansion diffusion here, and we dive into the 3 better answers, which describes how it grows continuously larger. And those are contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus. We start with stimulus diffusion, which is the rapid, widespread diffusion of a feature or trend throughout a population by contact from person to person. It spreads like the wave among fans in a stadium, without regard for a hierarchy and without requiring permanent relocation of people. It spreads to the next person who comes into contact with it. And usually, that's the next closest person, the physically closest person. This is why we had the discussion of density and concentration, because areas that are more dense have more people, or those people are closer together, tend to see these phenomenon move rapidly and widespread. We've all had experience with reducing contagious diffusion with COVID because we reduce contact. We avoid clustering to slow down the spread of this disease. And disease is a great example of contagious diffusion. But another one could be that when you post something on social media, a meme, and your friends see it, that's contagious diffusion. Our next type of expansion diffusion is hierarchical diffusion, which is the spread of a feature or trend from one key person or node of authority or power to other persons or places. Again, it's like a pyramid, and that key person is at the top. And whether it's Princess Kate's wedding dress sparking huge surges in attempts to imitate it, or professional athletes and celebrities endorsing a certain clothing brand, it's all about a hierarchy. So to use the internet again, if a social media influencer or celebrity posts something and their followers adopt it, that would be better described as hierarchical diffusion rather than contagious. That's how this stuff can get tricky. Even Starbucks or other specialized coffee shops follow a hierarchy. Starbucks opened in cities that have higher density and concentration of people, of customers, and from there, they spread to smaller cities and even small towns. Even still though, the vast majority of Starbucks location follows a hierarchy based on population density. Walmart, on the other hand, used a reverse hierarchy. Picture an upside-down pyramid. It began in small rural areas around Arkansas, the Hearth, and then spread out from there to major cities around the country. It started at the bottom of a hierarchy in rural areas and worked its way up to the top, where big cities are. The same could be said for rap or hip-hop music. It began with small groups in inner-city urban areas, and then diffused to become the most popular genre of music produced throughout the world. Stimulus diffusion is our last type of expansion diffusion, and it's probably the most challenging to understand. It is a form of diffusion in which a cultural adaptation is created as a result of the introduction of a cultural trait from another place. This definition isn't the greatest to get at the core of what stimulus diffusion is, but notice we emphasized adaptation. There is an adjustment depending on local demands or beliefs. Really what it is the spread of an underlying concept with local experimentation, change, adjustment, or adaptation. My favorite example is the spread of surfing. When you surf, you stand on a board, balance while riding over water. You may do tricks, or if you're like me, you fall a lot. So let's say that someone experiences surfing and realizes how amazing it is. So they returned to California and wanted to do that same kind of thing, that have that same sensation of balancing on a board, doing tricks, and falling down, but to do it on sidewalks instead. That's exactly what happened in the 1950s. But what happens if you live in Michigan and you want your kids to go outside during the winter, but all the water is frozen and the sidewalk's covered in snow? You got it. You go snurfing, which is actually what Sherman Poppin called it in 1965 when he patented the first snow surfing board. We just call it snowboarding now. And now I can fall over in the snow because bruises will be less numerous and my risk of drowning is much diminished. We see the same thing with the domestication of animals based on local climate. Siberians didn't have cattle to domesticate, but after seeing the benefits of domesticated cattle, decided to domesticate reindeer, an animal that was more conducive to the climate in Siberia. Finally, we talked last lecture about sustainability, and we can see stimulus diffusion here as well. In 2018, California banned plastic straws as a means to protect the environment. Other states may enact laws that are intended to maintain the same underlying idea, in this case protecting the environment, without specifically adopting a ban on plastic straws. So now that we've talked about the different types of diffusion, let's talk about the forces that influence them and the results of this diffusion. Obviously, distance is a force that influences the diffusion of ideas, trends, goods, and people. But as we've already noted, absolute distance and relative distance are different and have different effects. Absolute distance is the physical separation between two places on the Earth's surface measured by some accepted standard unit. And whether that is that I live 4 miles from school or the library is 2 kilometers away, it doesn't really matter the standardized unit. But relative distance can have a far bigger impact on diffusion. Relative distance transforms linear measurements into other units that could be more meaningful. My commute is 15 minutes at 7 a.m., but 30 minutes at 7:20 a.m. The closest store is a 5-minute drive, but a 25-minute walk. The Strip is a $10 Uber ride, but $25 by taxi. Notice that absolute distance is going to use accepted standardized units, but relative distance could use distance, but also time or money, depending on which is more meaningful. The relative distance between two places is again affected by connectivity and accessibility. So let's talk about the importance of distance. Tobler's first law of geography tells us that in a spatial sense, everything is related to everything else. But that relationship is stronger when items are near to one another. That decline in the relationship as distance increases is known as distance decay. Distance decay is the diminishing in importance and eventual disappearance of a phenomenon with increasing distance from its origin. And we mentioned at the end of the location lecture that accessibility is the ease with which we can reach a particular place. As distance increases, a location becomes more expensive to access or takes greater time. This cost and time component is known as the friction of distance. And friction of distance causes distance decay. With greater friction, there will be less interaction. And there is greater friction at greater distances. Essentially, here's what we need to know. With increasing distance, there will be less interaction. And we can see this distance decay in action with crime statistics. This graph shows that with certain crimes, in this case burglaries, criminals don't travel very far from home. The greatest amount of interaction, in this case we're talking about a crime being committed, is the shortest distance from their home or base of operations. So if a burglary occurs, the statistics suggest that the criminal is more likely to be within 1 kilometer of the crime scene rather than 8 or 9 kilometers. But in another way, distance is becoming less important as connectivity increases. In fact, as the world is becoming increasingly interconnected, the world is actually getting smaller. Not literally smaller, but figuratively, functionally smaller. The absolute distance between two places may have changed very little over the last 250 years, but the relative distances have changed dramatically. And this is called space-time compression. And you will see it a variety of different ways, from time-space compression to time-space convergence. Just be ready for that. It is the reduction in the time it takes to diffuse something to a distant place as a result of improved communication and transportation systems. Think about the communication systems of the 1800s. People would send letters and might have to wait months to hear a reply. It's no surprise that the term New World was given to the Americas. They might as well have been another planet, given the amount of knowledge and communication that existed between them and the Old World. Now, though, the internet and other telecommunications improvements have made the Earth functionally smaller. And the same goes with transportation, which is what this image shows. When Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, it took 37 days to reach the New World. That was in 1492. Fast forward 420 years, and it took the Titanic just over 3 days to make it 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic before it hit an iceberg and sank. Sorry, spoiler alert. And the difference was the steam engines inside the Titanic that propelled it across the Atlantic. Then, just 15 years later, Charles Lindbergh is able to cross the Atlantic all the way this time from New York to Paris in just 33.5 hours. How? He flew. It was the first transatlantic flight. Then 35 years later, John Glenn goes around the entire world 3 full times in 5 hours because he was orbiting the planet from space. And I always like to call attention to this. Imagine for a second that you were born in 1900. When you were 12, the Titanic sank. When you were 27, Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. By the time you're 62, John Glenn is in space. That happened in one lifetime. So imagine the transportation or communication changes that we're going to see during your lifetime. When you're 62, what are you going to be telling your grandkids about that maybe we can't even fathom today? And since the world has gotten so small, not literally, but functionally, more of our processes are global in scale. So we need to talk about globalization. This slide just provides 3 different interpretations of what globalization is. The definition we'll use in this class is the expansion of economic, political, and cultural processes to the point that they become global in scale and impact. Another of the approved textbooks describes it as a set of processes that are increasing interactions, deepening relationships, and accelerating interdependence across national borders. And geographer Andrew Kirby said that with globalization we are living, quote, not so much in a world without boundaries or in a world without geography, but more literally in a world as opposed to a neighborhood or a region. And one of the major features of globalization is an acceleration of trade. That's part of what they meant when they said increasing interactions. We're talking about trade along with other interactions. Those same improvements that made the world functionally smaller made it easier for goods to get around the world. In so doing, countries began to realize that they don't have to produce everything themselves, but rather they could focus on what they do better than other countries. By specializing in a certain good, process, or skill, countries could export that specialty more efficiently, earning more money while at the same time reducing costs, what we will call later economies of scale. Now, for example, we don't have to grow everything we eat because we can get cheaper goods from other areas who produce that food more efficiently, maybe because their climate's better for it, than we're able to produce here. And the improved transportation systems ensure that that food arrives fresh and on time. And what this has done is increased innovation as countries seek to improve their specialties, and has also opened some relatively closed political systems around the world. At the same time, there are issues related to globalization. By opening relatively closed political systems and the heightened demands of a globalized economy, one criticism that some argue against globalization is that richer countries, which we will call more developed countries or MDCs, impose their beliefs and demands on less developed or poorer countries, LDCs. Continuing in that criticism is that MDCs benefit more from globalization than do LDCs. And the same has been said for the rich and poor within countries. So the benefits of globalization are uneven. It's also been noted that as countries focus on their specialties, that can have a negative effect on the environment. Think about if your entire economy is based on the extraction of oil or the production of a certain agricultural product. Resources will be exhausted at much higher rates, or the physical environment may not get the rest it needs to remain productive over a long period of time. And this lack of diversification has economic impacts, but can also erode traditional economies or cultural practices. More people speak English now than ever before, but fewer young people are learning their ancestral languages. Is that good? Is it bad? It often depends on one's perspective. Finally, these practices have increased tension and violence. Perhaps the most notable example, at least for Americans, are the events of September 11, 2001. That morning, 4 airplanes were hijacked. The first 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. The next was flown into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The 4th crashed in a field in Pennsylvania, but the belief is that it was likely headed for Washington, D.C., either for the White House or the Capitol building. And notice that the first 2 targets were the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center. Those 2 buildings found in the financial district of Manhattan were a symbol of world trade, of globalization and America's prominent position in that global economy. The terrorists were never going to destroy America's economy, so they targeted a symbol of it. Same could be said with the Pentagon. That is a symbol of America's military. And the White House and Capitol building are both symbols of American democracy. In an increasingly globalized world, we enjoy many benefits, but also have to deal with new and increasing issues as well. That's where we'll end tonight. Have a good evening, and I'll see you back in class.